You might recognise this man, or you might not. In the mid-1940s, he worked in a bookshop on Oxford Road in Manchester. By the mid-1960s, however, he was the first president of Kenya. Now this, of course, is Jomo Kenyatta, a leading African figure from the 20th century. And in 1945, he and other African leaders came together in Manchester for a series of important meetings. Meetings that would inspire a movement towards a free African continent. This was the 5th Pan-African Congress. So when I was a student at Manchester Metropolitan University, quite a few years ago now, I used to pass this red plaque on the wall outside one of the buildings I used to have lectures in. And although I used to read it and think, oh, that's quite interesting, it never really sank in what it was saying and the gravity of the event it was talking about. Now, it's a period in Manchester's history I've been reading a lot about recently, and in 2020 it was the 75th anniversary which was celebrated here, and that spurred me into learning a lot more about this often ignored chapter of Manchester's history. And it doesn't take much research to realise that this was such a pivotal event in world history too, much more than we ever really acknowledge. Of all the iconic events in history for people of African descent, none had such a lasting worldwide impact as those 6 days in Manchester in 1945. And it starts with people like Jomo Kenyatta coming from all over the world to this free-thinking, radical city in the north of England. The Congress has its origins way back at the start of the 20th century, thanks to men like Henry Sylvester Williams, a Trinidadian lawyer, writer, and the first black progressive councillor for Marylebone Borough Council in London in 1906. After settling in Britain, he formed the African Association, later known as the Pan-African Association, in 1897, with the aim of educating black people on their rights and privileges, and representing people of African descent on the world stage where they were badly underrepresented. In 1900, Williams organised the first African conference in London. It was a small event, but in attendance was WEB Du Bois, American civil rights campaigner and author, and a man called John Richard Archer. Archer was born in Liverpool, worked for many years as a seaman and representing black people in the city, campaigning for the protection of black soldiers returning home from the First World War. At this time, cities across Britain were seeing spates of racist attacks against black communities, including Liverpool, where race riots incited by white mobs, several hundred strong, resulted in the death of Charles Wotton, a 24-year-old ship's fireman who was thrown into the Mersey and pelted with rocks until he drowned. It was incidents like this that spurred people like John Richard Archer to organise more congresses for black unity. Other meetings of the Congress followed in Paris, London, London again, and New York City. Now, at the time, a lot of the discussions centred around national identity. Now, this was a thing, this was a problem around the world, but also in places particularly like Liverpool, where you had thousands of black seafarers living and working and settling, who were being increasingly asked to prove their national identity, their Britishness. Now, a lot were born in countries which didn't have British-style passports or birth certificates. Now, this caused all sorts of problems. So what this meant was that British sailors from across the empire, many of whom had lived in Britain for years and years and years, were suddenly facing deportation. Now, this is kind of mirrored today even with the current Windrush scandal, but there's a bit more of a darker side to this story as well. So in many cases, what actually happened was you'd get black sailors from places like Liverpool who were being discharged in ports in West Africa and swapped for local men who would be paid a lot less to carry on the work. This despite the fact that these men had families, they had roots in Liverpool. And also, let's not forget the fact that these men from West Africa, who suddenly be given a job on these boats, were being discharged in Liverpool, despite the fact that they had roots and family in West Africa. Now, this all kind of came to an end between the wars with the decline of shipping, and more people started to move inland to places like Manchester. And during this time, you see the growth of Manchester's black community as more people move inland to look for land-based jobs. But before that, Manchester had already begun to attract a rather large black intelligentsia, drawn from the whole of the African diaspora. It was this reason that led to the 5th Pan-African Congress being held in Manchester and it was largely organised by black people actually living in the city. Manchester was a radical place for free-thinking people, and it was the natural setting for what was to become the largest congress yet. As a prominent voice in the Kikuyu Central Association, a significantly large ethnic group within what was then part of the British Empire, a fairly unknown Jomo Kenyatta travelled to Europe in the early 1930s, and Manchester was one of his destinations. While in Manchester, he worked at number 58 Oxford Road, the bookshop of the Pan-African Federation, which by my calculation was roughly around here somewhere. Now today, a lot has changed on Oxford Road, including the construction of a university building and the Mancunian Way over there. Immensely proud of his heritage, Kenyatta taught Kikuyu dance at the Dance House Theatre, and people would often see him walking about the cold grey streets in his traditional bright clothing. He was a natural organiser and incredibly proactive, but the main event was the 5th Pan-African Congress, held here, Chawton-on-Medlock Town Hall, in October 1945, just across the park from where the shop used to be. And this is it. This is the old facade. Obviously the rest of the building is now new, but this is where the meetings were held, where those great figures from the Black Liberation Movement gathered to discuss how to move forward. The Congress was one of the most significant moments in Africa's 20th century history, seeing 87 prominent delegates from all over the world attend to discuss the end of colonial rule on the continent. It was really the first time that people became aware of what African figures were saying politically. Of the other people, there was Kwame Nkrumah, who became the first president of Ghana in 1957, and Hastings Banda, who became the first president of Malawi in 1963. Amy Ashwood Garvey, wife of Marcus Garvey, the inspirational civil rights leader, spoke up for the rights of black women so well ahead of her time. And Kenyatta too, of course, was invited to give a speech. The Manchester Congress was praised because it was different to the other congresses because it opened participation up to local attendees, rather than a strictly academic bourgeois event. And one of the local activists attending was Len Johnson, a former championship boxer and now a Communist Party activist working for equality in Moss Side and Hume to the south of the city. A much understated hero of working people in Manchester, Johnson himself had been denied a championship title because of racist rules, despite winning it. So what was all this for? Now, apart from bringing all these people together to speak and meet in person, which was obviously a rare thing back then, it had two clear aims: the equality of all men and women, regardless of skin colour, and the end to racial discrimination against black people in public places, such as theatres, bars, public transport, and so on. Now, these are both very simple and obvious, but it says a lot about the time that these were both ambitious goals. Their final statement from the Congress expressed this powerfully. "We are determined to be free. We want education. We want the right to earn a decent living, the right to express our thoughts and emotions, to adopt and create forms of beauty. We will fight in every way we can for freedom, democracy, and social betterment." So European colonialism collapsed quickly after the end of the Second World War, mostly because these imperial powers couldn't afford to look after these empires anymore, but mostly because of the louder and louder voices growing in these places for self-determination and independence. And those women and men who gathered in Manchester in October 1945 formed a core group of people who galvanised the movement for black people the world over. Now, this was a movement that would not just return Africa to independence, but also shift the focus of world politics away from such overt imperialism. The movement towards African unity also continues to gather apace, an idea given much fanfare at the Congress in Manchester. In 2002, for example, the formation of the African Union, a trade bloc similar to the European Union, was established, emphasising the importance of African countries working together. Now, Africa today is still exploited massively by wealthy countries such as Britain, France, and so on, and the fight for equality and the end to racism continues. But that 5th Pan-African Congress was the moment when the ball started rolling in the right direction. And it's kind of embarrassing and disgusting that we just don't talk about it. This is a forgotten chapter in world history, in Manchester's history, but in world history. I mean, at the time, in 1945, the British press hardly even covered it. A founder of the NAACP, as well as a tireless civil rights campaigner, Du Bois went on to be a leading voice for African unity in the next 2 decades. He blamed capitalism for encouraging systematic racism, and so with all the McCarthyite witch hunts going on in the US during the post-war period, he became a target of the government. Eventually, he moved to Ghana at the invitation of Kwame Nkrumah, where he died aged 95. Nkrumah went on to become a leading voice for independence of his homeland, what was then shamefully called the Gold Coast by the British. In 1957, independence was won and he became the first president of Ghana. His socialist policies moved the country away from foreign dependence and towards African unity, but while on a visit to China in 1966, a violent coup seized control of the country and undid most of his work. He died in exile in 1972 in Romania. Amy Ashwood Garvey toured the world speaking on the rights and liberation of black women, setting up several organisations in London. Her tireless campaigning won her no titles and very little recognition in her day, but her legacy cannot be overstated. Finally, Kenyatta spent more time in London than Manchester, eventually travelled back to Kenya, was imprisoned for 7 years by the British, and then became president in 1964 when the country gained full independence. A controversial figure, he did improve a lot of things for most Kenyans, and is revered today in his home country. Not a bad impact for a man who once tramped up and down Oxford Road to work every day. Cheers everyone, thanks so much for watching, I hope you enjoyed it. Another overlooked chapter in Northern history. So from me and the cat that joined us halfway through, thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.